Hey guys, it's me, EODGamer here, and today we're back with another Honkai Star Rail video, and I have an exciting one for you, one that's really well requested by quite a number of you. You wanted to know my thoughts on how to put together a proper functioning team. Now in this video, I'm actually going to split it up into two parts because the early game is very different from the late game. In the early game, you really want to consider thinking about flexibility and efficiency of your team comps, and in the middle game and late game, I will talk a bit more later on. Now, I'm going to do this slightly different because if you realize most teams or people that make these kind of team building guides, they actually focus on DPSs and revolving teams around DPS. But to be really honest, coming from a consumer or a player point of view, you won't really want to care about a DPS if you're just playing for fun. And I think the way to look at it is actually to form your team around a focus, a character that you really like, be it whether it's a meta character or a really bad character. Now, I've already done guides and tier lists on these classes that you have, and you see these categories here on the channel. Can check it out if you want, but for now, I don't really care in this video whether the character is meta or not meta. If you like the character, you want to play that character, and that's the first slot that you want to focus on. So slot 1 will be the focus, the character that you like, not whether it's meta or not. And in terms of slot 2, the slot 2 is really going to be your synergetic character to focus on your slot 1. So whatever this character is lacking, or you want to make this character even better than what he or she is going to do, slot 2 is basically to enhance this version. You might be asking, what synergy am I trying to create? So basically there are three main focuses for every team comp. You want to have good damage in your roster. You want to have some sort of sustain in your roster as well to keep up the either shielding or healing, because you don't want to dish out like tons of damage and you in the end you just get one-shotted and all your DPSs die. And the last thing that you want is flexibility. You can have a very strong damage and sustain team, but all of them are of maybe the same element or perhaps all single target. You won't be able to tackle a lot of the other content that's available in the game. So this three main trinity, so to speak, is something that you want to find balance in when you're forming your team comps, and is what I'm going to be talking about as we go on. But now let's continue with slot number 3. So in terms of slot number 3, you have your focus here and your synergy that is going to be boosting up your focus. The third slot really you want to focus on is your pivot. And what do I mean by a pivot? A lot of people think that, oh, if let's say for example Bronya is really strong, so Bronya is going to be in a category like a pivot where she can fit into most teams very well. Or what if you have a character that is your focus, you want to put Bronya as your main focus team. So in this case, let me just explain a little bit what I mean, is when you have a character that's already so versatile, for example, you are playing Bronya and maybe you want to put CD into this synergetic section because Bronya works very well with CD, but maybe you don't really like CD that much, but these two, combos very well together. So these two are going to form your main bulk of your team. What a pivot means is this character is going to add value to the whole team, but also it can be used to form a different team later on. So slot 3 inherently is a flexible slot where the character here should be a very, very versatile and efficient character. For example, you have characters like Estar or Tingyun, but if you are running Bronya in this slot, you probably won't want to run them here. So for any other team comp that Bronya is not here or any Harmony character is not here, generally this can be filled by a Harmony class pretty well. But I think in this situation, if you have Bronya here, a very good pivot to have will probably be a healer like Natasha, Luo Ca or Bai Lu, for example. This pivots you very nicely if you invest in these characters. They can easily go into another team. Let's say you decide, oh, I no longer want to play Bronya. Maybe I'm going to play, I really like Blade, for example. So now I'm going to put Blade here and maybe I'll change this up to Luo Ca here. So in this sense, if you have like this situation, you want to form your team comp where your pivot changes respectively as well. So in this case right now, I would definitely put in, for example, Estar here or maybe Tingyun here as your pivot. And this pivot is basically characters that can just transition over to other team comps very easily, and it's going to be your most efficient character to build. Remember, in the early game, your resources are very limited, so you don't have like the resources to build every single element, every single character. You want characters that can scale very well into the middle game, so you don't have that situation where, let's say you build a character and then becomes useless because you just put a 5-star that is way better and then you waste that huge chunk of resource as well. And the last slot right now, as you can see here, is really a gap fill. So this is just a basic introduction to the 4 slots, and I will now give you several situations I have. Let's start off first with, of course, a free-to-play alternative. Because I'm a little biased, I'm going to probably main Dan Heng and Kafka when the game starts. So let's talk a bit about a very popular character, Dan Heng, right now. For, let's say I'm having him as my focus, who is my DPS. The second section is really on like synergies and who works really well with him. And in my opinion, I think the best case for the early game is you want to put your synergetic character who is also a pivot to bump up this flexibility factor. And I think a character that is very flexible and synergetic with Dan Heng, for example, could be Bronya, because when he gets character specific buffs, he actually gets wind penetration as well. So Bronya works really well with Dan Heng, and although they are both wind element and maybe you lose out a bit on the flexibility, these two characters can be ported on later as they scale much more towards the late game. I talked about this in my other videos already, in like my Han class guide, which I recommend you guys check it out if you haven't already. Or perhaps you can also put Ting Yun here, who is very synergetic with Dan Heng as well, as he gives him quite a lot of attack buffs together with energy buffs as well. His burst is quite high on damage, so giving him the extra energy restoration might not be a bad thing as well. So for example, if you play these two in a synergetic team here, Asta doesn't work as well, but definitely can fit here as well. And once you already have an attack buffer, you don't really need Asta in this point. So what I would do actually, I will actually bring in, for example, Physical MC here. I think Physical MC is a very strong pivot to have in the early game. As a destruction physical class, Physical MC offers a bit of AoE, which is what he lacks, Dan Heng lacks significantly. And if you have the AoE damage in terms of a destruction class, and not only that, you can also scale a Physical MC into Fire MC later on to give you that eventual shielding as well. I do think MC is a very solid choice to fit in most teams, and I highly recommend MC to build MC and not just leave it behind. Of course, unless you are a whale and you have every single character built, then maybe you want to not think about it, but this is a very efficient character. And remember, in the early game, we are looking for flexibility and efficiency. So now that we have this 4 team column, we have a bit of AoE damage, we have a bit of single target damage with a good amount of ability from these two characters to buff the teams respectively. What we are really lacking right now is either sustain or more AoE damage. So unfortunately, when you are going for a very high amounts of flexibility in the team comp, you realize you will start to give up because there's too much flexibility. You'll start to give up either on these two factors. And in the early game, if you don't have a healer, this is a destruction character, and you will realize that you will suffer a lot in the early game because your sustain is significantly lacking in this team. Damage is also not extremely fantastic, as Physical MC and Dan Heng won't clear a lot of content, but I do think that if you are looking for like you just want to survive the early game as best as you can, because the monsters are also not super difficult to clear as well, I do think an option like Herta will be a very solid one to fill in the gaps for the 4th slot, giving you a bit of more AoE damage, a bit more burst ability. So in the early game, I would stack triple DPS to get you through the first part of the game, but these characters in these 3 sections scale very well to the end game as well, because Dan Heng can become more of like a nihility character where he becomes like a boss controller and debuffing the enemy speed. So this is how I'm like thinking of my team comps when I'm rotating. So the most important thing to keep on top of my mind is it must be flexible, these characters must be able to be used for other team comps as well, and it must be very efficient, which means like for every resource you pump into these characters, they cannot be one day not be able to use. Of course, Herta out of these 4 is the most inefficient because she's a DPS after all, but her ability to clear a lot of AoE content makes you able to focus a lot on these characters which scale off into the slightly later game as well. But okay, now this is more like a Dan Heng team. Of course, if you don't want to use Bronya, you can as well. You can of course run a very simple team like this. For example, if you really like Asta and you just want a very simple, not very expensive team, you can run Dan Heng, you can run Asta, you can run Fire MC, Physical MC, which they will transition later on, and you can run Herta. Of course, you're lacking a bit of sustain, but I do think early game sustain might not be the main thing you're missing out on, because if you have enough damage to burst down the enemies, which they are not really a problem in the early game, then they won't have time to even damage you. But later on, this factor does become much more significant, and in my opinion, I think this will would be my recommendation for most people who are looking for scalability. It will not be something that you can just press and play because you don't have sustain. A character like Natasha, as I recommended in my absolute beginner's guide, will be much better for absolute beginners. But if you guys don't mind a little bit of challenge in terms of knowing, planning your abilities to be able to one-shot the target before they attack you, and noticing on turn order and stuff like that, these 4 characters I think will do very well for the early game for most accounts, and it's definitely my recommendation. But for now, let me talk about another character that is going to be, I guess, quite well used, which is Serval, because she's a free character, and let's form a team for Serval right now. Okay, now let's talk a bit about Serval. We will be talking about another character which I suspect is going to be the first banner, Sealy, in a little bit. Of course, we won't be able to cover every single character, but the concepts I apply here should transition across any other character. If any new character comes up, these concepts will actually work really well for you, and I don't want to waste your time by going to every single character, but more broad concepts on what you should focus on. So now I'm not going to be putting another main DPS in the focus slot because that will be not very efficient. I'm going to be putting Serval in the synergetic slot because she's going to be a free character, and maybe if you're not pulling Kafka, for example, Serval actually does quite a lot, or you're not pulling Kafka or Jingyuan rather, Serval is actually a pretty good AoE DPS if you're looking for a lightning element. So definitely your focus here in terms of who is going to be synergetic with Serval. Kafka is one of them. Kafka likes shock quite a bit and works quite well with Serval over here. But in another sense, I think a main DPS who is maybe a single target will work really well, but we don't want to put a main DPS here. So probably the gap fill will be a single target DPS, like maybe Susang here. Or of course you can use the 5 stars Yanqing and CD, but we're going to keep it quite efficient. We're going to put in a single target DPS as your gap filler. So for example, these are your 2 characters that you want in your gap fill slot. Your Serval is here. You have the damage check in terms of the AoE damage as well as the single target damage. And a character that I think works pretty well with Serval, I think definitely will be a character like Esta. Esta gives a lot of attack buffs, which Serval actually has a very high amounts of base attack for a 4-star character already, or SR character rather. And Esta also gives a lot of speed buffs, and when speed is basically almost the equivalent of energy restoration, because the more you act, basically the more energy you get back. And I think Esta as a focus is not too bad because she's a very efficient and flexible character as well. So putting her as a focus for this section, we can use the free Serval which everyone is getting in the synergetic slot. What you're really lacking in this pivot now is something defensive. So you see, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of Esta and Dan Heng here with good flexibility. You have very good damage in terms of a very high attacking Serval with very strong attacks from either Susang or Dan Heng as well. Esta herself does very good fire break as well. You have all options here of differing elements, but what you're really lacking is something a bit more defensive, and this is where I think I'll put in a character, for example, like Natasha, to get a bit more sustain going on. Of course, it's not as excellent as, for example, a defensive unit, like maybe you can put in main MC. These two works pretty well as well. But I think overall, if you have a team like this, where it's very different from what we saw previously in the Dan Heng example, you are able to form more team comms to tackle the middle game content. So just something to work around about. But now let's talk about Sealy in terms of what, let's say, because she's likely going to be the first banner, let's see what team comms work pretty well with her as well. I guess the choice is, if you're pulling for Sealy, then likely she's going to be your focus in terms of this game. Of course, if you get any other characters like Himiko or any other standard banner like Yanqing and stuff like that, with other guides available on the channel like Hunt Comparison, is Sealy better than Yanqing and stuff like that, do check it out for more detailed information. I'll be making more character guides in future as well. But specifically, let's talk a bit about some team comms which I think Sealy is going to work really well in and you can consider as well. I'll also talk a bit about like some exotic team comms which I've tried before and I think really works really well. So Sealy is a character that likes attack and speed. And the more she acts, the harder. She's a hyper carry basically. So if you have more characters that support her to do what she does and doesn't take away the attention that she requires, she will excel tremendously. She's a character that is not as strong as Yanqing in the early game, but scales very, very strongly into the late game, especially if the enemy bosses summons any small minions for her to one-shot as well. So I think in terms of the synergy, most players will intuitively already know that a character like Bronya will work really well with her. But basically any Harmony character that buffs up Sealy is going to be a really solid character for her, because she really wants that additional attack, and the additional speed. In my opinion, I think out of the three of them, in terms of the most cost efficient, because if you are talking about having to spend all your choice selector on Bronya, it might not be efficient if you can pick up another character for the later game, like let's say Welt, or maybe if you need more defensive ability, you can pick up Bailu or Gepard as well. So in terms of efficiency out of these three, I do think if you are playing CD, Esta is going to be the most efficient choice in terms of premium currency or other resources that's not factored in. So, but all three will definitely work really well. All three are very flexible as well, super efficient, and you can pivot them on later on. So in terms of pivot, a character that is maybe not super required in this team comp, but it's going to be really good, I would definitely say is some sort of sustain or shielder. I definitely do like a bit more shielding for CD, as her stats are actually very low. Her defensive stats are very low, relatively squishy, and you want her to be able to survive certain attacks. Of course, if you are confident that maybe the enemy doesn't have a burst ability to burst her down, you can of course run a character like Natasha. And all of these really can be replaced with characters like Gepard can be replaced with Fire MC, and any other healer can also be put in this slot as well. If you want to know the differences between them, I've classed guides already. But in a sense, these two characters will be filling on the sustain factor quite well. So in this case, you have damage, you have sustain, you have flexibility, as all of them currently are of differing elements. Of course, if you choose Esta and you choose Fire MC, you have a double up of fire. And if you do that, I do highly recommend you pick up Silver Wolf as well. So if you have CD with Esta, with Fire MC and Silver Wolf, you actually get a double fire and double quantum. And Silver Wolf's ability is she excels in dual element comms or mono element comms pure quantum. And I really do think this character is one of the better characters available. If she doesn't come out at the start, of course, other characters that you can choose to have is someone more of an AoE nature. I would say that Esta and Fire MC offer a bit of AoE already and would be my preferred choice with CD at the game's launch. But if you are looking for maybe a little bit more AoE nature, what you can actually do is, in terms of exotic team, I actually really like to play Kafka in the 4th slot as well. Because Esta gives attack buffs to all 3 characters and herself, and speed buffs the whole team. Kafka benefits from speed and attack, and also does very good AoE damage. Of course, another option to have would be to put the free Serval in this 4th slot over here, giving you a bit of lightning, a bit of AoE damage, solid character, and it's also free. So you're playing with 3 free characters in a sense, and you're playing with CD, who you really like as well. So I think these are some considerations that I will think about when I'm focusing in the early game. I think the main thing that, regardless of what character you decide to put as your focus, whether it's Himiko, whether it's Welt, or stuff like that, you want to think about are these characters going to be efficient in the early game compared to the slightly later game. A character that is really strong but might not scale well in the early game and is better later on will be a character like Pella, for example, who is more of a debuffing class and really starts to shine later on as well. And of course, Welt is also another character that starts to shine the later the game gets as well. So I think these are characters that are really strong, but I won't really build in the early game, so to speak, because in the early game you're looking for efficiency to maximize every single resource you have and giving you the most amount of output as well. Now that you survived the early game, let's talk a bit about the mid game. Now, mid game in Honkai Star Rail, really, there are many ways to define like mid game, right? Whether the enemies are going to be much stronger or you're facing the later challenge. I don't consider artifact farming and gear farming and the RNG of that as mid game. I think mid game is really the main challenges that players would face, and that would be 2 things. First is the simulated universe, and second thing definitely will be the memory of chaos. But we will talk about that in a little bit. So in terms of the simulated universe, why there are only 3 slots here is when you start off the simulated universe in one of the challenges, you start off with only 3 characters and you get the 4th one later on. So following a similar pattern that we actually have the focus here, the synergetic characters here, the 2 characters that you're basically going to be playing as a strong duo, and your 3rd one is actually going to be your gap filler in terms of what these 2 really need. So for example, if you're running in with a free-to-play comp like maybe Danheng and Serval, which most players would actually have, as they are totally free units, single target, good AoE, your gap filler will probably be like Natasha in a sense, because you want that sustain, or maybe you can go with Fire MC for that defensiveness. Simulated universe, you don't really know exactly what challenge you're getting, and it's like a roguelike situation where you get different buffs, differing buffs. So the more versatile these 3 categories are, the better, of course. And you definitely want to remember these 3 categories. And in the mid game, really, I would say the most important thing is versatility. Of course, efficiency matters a lot as well, because the challenges that you face in the mid game rise exponentially compared to the mid game in terms of the different permutations the game can throw at you, and you want to have the characters well built, but also well built enough to tackle as many of these random situations, because the memory of chaos might rotate, and then you have a different main boss, or simulated universe might rotate, and then you might not have a character to deal with that boss if you build everyone like fire or something like that. So those are some things that I would be thinking about when building a team in terms of the mid game. And of course, the fourth slot that we dropped is the pivot, because in the simulated universe you will be getting more characters later on. The most important thing is to survive the first 3 characters to have and to form a very proper strong team. You will realize if you bring like triple DPS, you'll keep failing because maybe some of them require you a bit more sustain, or maybe you just don't have the physical element, or you don't have the lightning element to push through that particular section. So that is why in the early game we emphasize a lot on versatility and efficiency, because when you have a wide roster you can tackle a lot of what the simulated universe is. And the pivot here is actually not going to be very important, because you are not pivoting away from this main team. You are going to be adding people into your main team based on what the simulated universe needs. For example, if the simulated universe has an enemy that is weak to, let's say, quantum, and your main 4 team doesn't have a quantum character, you can consider adding later on a quantum character and stuff like that. But this is the easy part, simulated universe. Where it gets really challenging in my opinion is looking at the memory of chaos. Memory of chaos is basically, for those of you who came from Genshin Impact, it's like the Spiral Abyss, where you bring in a team of 2 teams of 4 tackling a boss, and the requirement for Memory of Chaos is you have to clear the floor in a time limit, a turn time limit. What this means is in a sense a DPS check, which means you can't just bring in like 4 sustain. You can bring in for simulated universe like all sustain and just push through eventually, because there's no like time limit and stuff like that. But Memory of Chaos, there is like a DPS check. So this ratio, or this trinity balance, needs to be really followed quite religiously, so to speak. So these 4 characters that we selected in the early game that you were playing and you decide to focus on will actually be used here for your team 1. So your focus and synergetic will just be copied down to this part, and what I'm going to recommend you do is bring your pivot to this part here. Your gap filler, on the other hand, depending on what character, if it's also synergetic, you might want to consider splitting it up into a 2x2. Of course, in this case where you have 2 main DPSs very well built, you will want to actually split your main DPSs up, and you want to shift your gap fill up here. So the idea here is to balance your best built team into something that is split evenly across 2 teams. And from here we will do the exact same strategy of finding your next focus or a balancing factor. So in a sense, Servile will shift here to a focus unit. Of course, your synergetic characters have to be based on Servile as well as Dunheng here. So that is why I said your first team must be very flexible, because you don't want a character that, for example, doesn't really fit into most teams. Like maybe you have a character like that doesn't fit into most teams, like maybe Hook, who relies a lot on Asta. Then you'll realize, oh, I'm stuck with this team comp, because Hook cannot really go anywhere else without Asta, as she needs the speed buff quite a bit as well. Or maybe Jingyuan or Sealy, who's generally a hyper carry nature. You realize that, oh, all my team needs to be buffing her, if not they won't be doing as much output as well. So that is why flexibility, I mentioned, was really important, and is the main reason is for the memory of chaos. But really, the first tip, split your main team, your 4 teams that you had in the early game, into a 2-2 formation. Most of the time your main DPSs will split up, one into their focus and the other one into the other team's focus as well. Your pivot and gap fill will also want to be split up, because you want to balance out the ratios. I do think that characters that are worth building will be characters like I'll just talk about 4 stars right now. I do think that these characters will add a pretty strong balance to your entire roster. Especially these back half 4, they can go in pretty much any team. And if I were to run maybe a double 4-star team to tackle most content, this might probably be the teams that I can work towards. You have strong single target to get that damage. You have strong AoE, similar for here, where they balance each other out. You have your pivots in terms of characters that can be easily swapped around like that, and they will still be doing a good amounts of effect. Pella debuffs the entire team's defense. Natasha provides some sort of sustain, a bit more damage if you wanted to. And of course, I think not to mention Fire MC is really strong as well, which I'll actually put as quite a high priority to be in either one of these teams. And if you like this way of like presenting to you content, do consider checking out like our other videos on perhaps a tier list video on the characters we have available, or maybe you want to see more specific class details as well. If you're an absolute beginner, welcome to Honkai Star Rail and see you in the journey ahead. I'll be making more content as well, so stay tuned, like and subscribe. See you in the next video.